Thank you, Donna. Very, very interesting. And now Veton is going to put all of the things that we have learned in all of this conference into context with his own experience in dealing with these issues in Kosovo. So, Veton.
No problem. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Carlos especially, and of course Tim and Ina for having me here in Miami. I had not thought that I would be sharing my experience from Kosovo in Miami, but you never know where these things bring you. For the purpose of today, I thought of invoking the name of a well-known writer who wrote around here, one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century. And no, he's not Ernest Hemingway. It's Alejo Carpentier, who I want to use for this occasion. Now, Alejo Carpentier was the master of Cuban literature. He was an inspiration for a whole generation of writers, especially for the Latin American boom, for Garcia Marquez, for Carlos Fuentes. And he was the one who, in El Reino de este Mundo, talked about the history of Latin America as lo real maravilloso. He coined the term that would be later translated into magical realism. The two basic notions employed by Carpentier I want to use with poetic license here. The first is that the continent, the Latin American continent, produced its own interpretation of reality that was different from the North American and the European interpretation. It was not conventional. It was a convention in its own, in its juxtaposition. And the second is that the continent, that Latin America, in its tradition, in its history, has produced the cohabitation of these two juxtaposed terms. So magic and realism living together, lo real y lo maravilloso living together. Now, the first notion of Carpentier serves for me today to have this very important disclaimer. Because although whatever my experience is, there's no interpretation of reality that is applicable from one part of the world to the other. You cannot say, I've had this experience, and therefore it's applicable in your part of the world, in your society, in your country. No crisis is equal to the other. No solution to the crisis is automatically applicable to the other. Every crisis needs a custom-made solution. And so there is not a model which somebody from the Balkans or from Central Europe or the Middle East can replicate in a situation. Now, that said, there are behaviors in a crisis which are universal because human endeavors are universal. All humans aspire to freedom, and they try to define freedom with the institutions of the states. And so now there's a need to invoke the second principle of Carpentier, which is the cohabitation of both the fact that every part of the world is unique, but that every man and woman in this world have universal traits, and that these two concepts live together. In 1989 and 1990, I was part of the leadership in Kosovo at the time against a dictatorship in a country that was being dismembered, the former Yugoslavia. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. We were watching it as our lives changed, and we defined our objective as one of an independent Kosovo, a democratic state, part of Europe. We also defined that we would reach that objective through nonviolent means, that we would not fight wars. The institutions of the state at the time were occupied by Serbian forces. A rule of war was imposed on us. We had to go through curfews. Most of the people in our institutions were kicked out from their jobs at gunpoint. Our schools were closed, and our health system, or the doctors from our health system were kicked. A system of apartheid was installed where a 10% Serb minority was ruling over a 90% Albanian majority, all of them excluded from the institutions of the state. What we did was then try to create parallel realities. The Serbian society, or the Serbian rule, created its own reality, which was imposed by the gun, its will. What we tried to do was to create a parallel reality of nonviolent resistance, in which we would say to the Serb occupation force that you have taken our schools, but you have not taken our school children. You have taken the buildings, but we can put those school children into private buildings, into homes that people will donate, and therefore we will recreate our own educational system. We told the Serbian occupying forces that they had kicked out our doctors, but that we could create parallel clinics. That it was about the human element. It was not about the bricks and the mortar. That what we wanted to do was preserve our society functioning in institutions that we had created. Whilst our institutions were taken and our money was being taken by taxes, we could not control it, we created a different system of financing of these institutions. And our very dispersed diaspora in Europe and the United States willingly contributed 3% of their income as a tax to finance all of these institutions. Throughout almost 10 years, we maintained a resistance to occupation with a nonviolent means. The Serbian regime killed our people. Whoever protested was shot at. What we did then was, and they were inviting us to a war, what we did then was try to create a parallel interpretation of what we wanted. And so I led a protest of 200,000 people carrying an empty coffin in a protest that was called Burial of the Violent Today. We went through town escorted by many hundred policemen with heavy machine guns. But what we wanted to show was that we had the energy, we had the force to resist, and that we would be doing it in such a way. We wanted to say that we have a different interpretation of reality than they have. Parallel state, a state where occupation and our own institutions of freedom live, is Carpentier at its fullest. It's this life of juxtapositions. In the 90s, in the beginning as a leadership, and not a very inventive one, although discarding this issue of parallel institutions, we were caught in our own trap. And our trap was that somehow history would develop, somehow things would be coming, somehow we would be liberated, somehow there would be a deus ex machina that would come and bring us freedom, that things would change simply because we had the will for them to change, that because we were on the right side of history, things will be changing in the right side of history. But seeing that we were moving from one day to the other in occupation and in a war that was disintegrating Yugoslavia, we were in the neighborhood of Bosnia where more than 200,000 people were killed, and the beginning of armed resistance in our country, we decided to engage in a process of talks with the Serbian regime. It was one of the hardest decisions we had to make, both as a leadership and individually. I myself was the most resistant of all in not going to meet Milosevic. I thought that it was morally unacceptable that my hand shake the hand of a man who's responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, that I did not want to have the blood of the people on my hands. Nevertheless, at the last moment, I decided that I would participate in such an engagement, that I would go and shake his hand. And as I was shaking his hand, that I would tell him that he was responsible for the deaths of many people and for the tragedy of many people. I thought that it was necessary, and it was my responsibility to go that step further, because it was part of creating the interpretation of reality that we had opted for. That we would be opting for the interpretation that would say that we are willing to engage in every occasion in order to transform our society and reach peace and independence and democracy for our country. At the same time, this initiated a process by which, under international pressure, both sides, both our side and the Milosevic side, was invited to talks about peace in Rambouillet in France. We were invited under the precondition that we accept that the final outcome of this conference would not be independence. We had spent almost a decade resisting, and at the end we had to accept to go to a conference which, as its outcome, had preconditioned that our goal would not be achieved. Nevertheless, we accepted. We accepted because we thought, and it took a lot of time, hard time convincing, that it was not important to have our objective spelt out explicitly, that what was important was to have a roadmap within those talks that would one day bring us to the objective as we wanted. We wanted an interim arrangement that would get us to the road. Of course, who would not have wanted an independence given by the great powers? Say, here you are. You're good guys. You have been nonviolent. We grant you independence and we will protect your independence. That did not happen, because that's not how life happens. You don't get things for free. You have to move forward on them. And what we did is, we engaged in Rambouillet. We tried to develop a roadmap. We tried to integrate our objectives into that roadmap, and we succeeded. In 1999, we got to the point of actually being liberated through NATO action. But although we had integrated our objectives into the roadmap, we had not prepared for what we had been fighting for so many years. We had not prepared for being liberated. We had not prepared for assuming responsibility once we were liberated. We had not prepared to assume from day one the responsibilities of people who want to run their own affairs. And therefore, what we did as a society, once being liberated, was create more problems than we had solved. We engaged as a society in persecution of minorities. Those that had ruled us feared us now. And we as a majority, or elements from our society as a majority, persecuted that minority. 15 years onwards, we are still haunted by 6 months of chaos and anarchy that created so much mayhem that we still live with trials and the enormously bad energy that exists between our communities, between the majority and the minority. So yes, things change, but once they change, you have to be prepared to assume your responsibilities for them. And that's why at the talks for independence, and I led the part of the negotiations that deal with minority rights, I thought that it would be very important to create a legal framework that would guarantee the minorities living in Kosovo, and there are almost less than 10% of those minorities living there, the rights which are unparalleled at the European level. And let me illustrate it, not with the Serbs who were the people who ran the affairs and were more persecuted. Let me illustrate it with the Roma, with the Gypsies, who are a persecuted minority all over Europe. We invited the Roma to have their language as a language in official use in the municipalities where they compose a sufficient minority. And that means 10% of the population. Wherever there's a 10% minority of Roma people in Kosovo, they also can use their own language in official use. This is unprecedented at a European level. How does this translate into the Cuban situation? And as I said, I don't know Cuba. I don't think anything is applicable automatically. I'm just saying this is what I see in this environment. Fidel Castro in 2005 said in his speech, let me quote this, here's a conclusion I've come after many years. Among all the errors we may have committed, the greatest of them all was that we believed that someone really knew something about socialism, or that someone actually knew how to build socialism. It seemed to be a sure fact. Whenever they said, that's the formula, we thought they knew, just as if one is a physician. So let us turn around this statement of wisdom achieved through trial and error, a lot of error as well, into a prescription for the present Cuba. Is there anyone who really has a formula for building democracy in Cuba? Is there a magical prescription? Is there an instruction manual for building? Is there a legal land for democracy where you can get your building blocks and say, this is how you create democracy? That would assume, again, the same level of imposition on Cuba, albeit with less lethal forms. The one that Castro talked about when he said that they were looking for this formula for socialism. In fact, I don't believe in changes that are imposed. I don't believe in changes that come abruptly in formulas. I don't think of a prepackaged liberal democracy that suddenly opens itself and then you have a country running in order. I think change happens, and it happens in some places more chaotically than in others. I also think change is happening as we are speaking. I believe it is irreversible. There are two things, though, that we do not know I think the time factor is something that one does not know in changes. Things can move more rapidly than in one place than in the other. Change can be evolutionary in the next 20, 50, 70 years. It can be evolutionary in 1 year, revolutionary. And the second is the path that that change takes. I don't think there's a linear way in history. I don't think you move only in the right direction. You can move in zigzags. You can move backwards. And the changes that happen can be dramatic, and not only for the good. Albania is a very good example. A country run by a Stalinist dictatorship for 50 years awoke one morning as a country ready for democratic elections. They could not believe it. They could not believe that they could get Enver Hoxha's statue down. They did. It went down. Once it went down, they chanted democracy and elections, and they got elections. And when they got to elections, they elected a government that was not necessarily of the choice of the opposition. And in the next elections, they elected another government, which looked much better for the opposition. But they've spent so many years changing governments and not dealing with one very important issue, the most important issue in changing of structure, the nature of a country, from Stalinism to a democracy, and that is the property issue. They had not dealt with a property issue in a way that would be inviting for the majority of the population. Every government dealt with a property issue in the way that it could help its own cronies. So if you were a friend of the minister and you could claim that your family's property had been taken by the communist regime, you got it back. But if you were not a friend of the minister, you did not get back that property. And that caused an internal conflict in Albania that then developed into more difficult issues such as the pyramid schemes, that people suddenly thought that you could get rich by simply putting $200 in a pyramid scheme and getting your $300 back after that month, and saying this is the wonders of capitalism, how it transforms how you get your money for. And so they almost went to civil war. Not almost. 3,000 people were killed in 1997 when people went and took out the depots, the arms from the Army Arm Depot, and started fighting what actually was a civil war. A country disintegrated because they had not dealt with the single most important issue in a transition, and that is how to create conditions for transformation in which there is at least a degree of consensus that invites most of the people around that transformation. And the most important issue for them that could have created consensus was actually property. Because one of the greatest fears in transformations from Stalinism into an open society is actually who gets what out of it. From an egalitarian society, the majority does not want to move into a society in which only a small portion of that society reinstates its own property. How to create social cohesion, that was one of the most important questions that Albania had. If we use Carpentier in Cuba today, and this is the movement from an egalitarian society to an open society, I think the main question is how to reconcile the two realities that have been built over the last 50 years. One reality is the revolutionary reality that has created an unprecedented educational and social network, unprecedented at Latin American level. Health services that probably no other Latin American country has, and educational services. So how to reconcile that reality, which is shared, and probably shared, I believe, by most Cubans in Cuba. How to reconcile that reality with the enormous price that was paid to construct that reality in terms of human rights, dignity, human lives. Because that reality is also valid. 4,000 or 5,000 people have been sentenced to death, Carlos told me. Many more thousands of people have gone through jail. That is a reality as well. That is part of the same reality. And the question is, how do you integrate these into one? Well, the way to do it is not to impose one reality. No reality can be imposed on the other. And the question is how to create dialogue between these two realities. That dialogue assumes that, as in our case, you do not spell out the end immediately. You spell out the road through which you achieve to that end. And that actually creates conditions for the people engaged in that dialogue to assume more responsibility and to have more faith in that dialogue. In 2013, the Harvard study group published its happiness report. And among some of the issues, one of the main things that creates happiness in human nature is thinking about the future. It's simply in human nature, no other living being has a capacity to project the future. And humans derive pleasure from devising future. And the dialogue is exactly about that. It's about projecting the future. The more people are engaged in devising the future for Cuba, the happier this process will be, the more positive energy there will be in it. And with this final thought, I finish my speech. Thank you.
Okay. All right, now we take a 15-minute break and then come back, and we will hear from Dr. Jose Solis Silva right after the break. Thank you.